In the last three history videos, we've talked about the run-up to the Civil War, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, and then the introduction of the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically set up referenda in Kansas and Nebraska as to whether to be slave states or not. That led to both sides sending in settlers with their black slaves or free people in an effort to pack the state to win it for the cause that they believed in, which really led to violence and the beginning, truly, of the Civil War. Well, James Buchanan was elected president in 1856, took office in 57, and he deserves, hands down, the title of the worst president of the United States we've ever had. He was absolutely horrible. And the first thing he did when he came in was he got in touch, as he shouldn't have, with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, who was an appointee of President Jackson's, been on the court for a long time. And Taney was a Maryland slaveholder. And of the 9 judges on the court, 7 had slaves. And there was a decision working its way up to the court in the case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner took him into a free state. I think it was Illinois. And while he was in Illinois, he took the position that he was a free man, and he escaped and put a life together as a free person. Then under the Fugitive Slave Act, his former owners went up, captured him, and brought him back and said they had the right to enslave him. And the issue went to the Supreme Court. And the question was, if you are a slave in a state without slavery, can you be a slave or can you be a free person? And the Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, absolutely made the Civil War a vital necessity, because they said a slave is property, just like a loaf of bread or a car, a horse. No, and they said, and this is a quote from the decision, a Negro has no rights which a white man is bound to honor. No rights at all. You can do whatever the hell you want. And it didn't matter if a state was slave or free. What that meant was that de facto we had nationwide slavery, because if Southerners moved into the North and brought their slaves with them, the people of the North could not decide that their state would be slave-free, because under Dred Scott, they had to go ahead and allow slavery when it was brought into the state. And Dred Scott further said that no territory could make slavery illegal when it was coming into the Union. So all of these compromises that have held things together for 30, 35 years suddenly went right out the window. And it posed the naked question, which, without any varnish at all, of was slavery right or wrong? Now, at the same time that this was happening, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850, was cutting deeply in these northern states. And there were many instances where Southerners would try to reclaim their fugitive slaves or get federal government officials to do so. And local mobs or sometimes local state governments would interpose themselves and try to stop them from taking the slaves back. And in 1858, it was Stephen Douglas, who was the author of the popular sovereignty doctrine that overturned everything, ran for re-election to the Senate from Illinois, and his opponent was Abraham Lincoln. And they began the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the key moment in those debates came at Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln said to Douglas, "Isn't slavery morally wrong? How can you delegate the decision as to whether to adopt or not adopt slavery to a vote of the people, especially since the slaves aren't counted as people? Don't you believe that slavery is wrong and that the states have a right to keep slaves out of their state?" In other words, you for or against the Dred Scott decision. And Douglas, facing a pro-union, anti-slavery electorate in Illinois and needing to get reelected, said that he agreed that the Dred Scott decision was wrong, that he agreed that slavery was wrong. Well, what that did is it split the Democratic Party completely in half, because Douglas Grant was going to run for president in 1860, and he had Southern and Northern support. That's why he adopted popular sovereignty. He could straddle the issue and say, I don't have a position, let it be voted on by the people. But after the Freeport debate, he couldn't do that anymore. And when Douglas was nominated for president in 1860, the South walked out of the Democratic Party and nominated a guy named Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president, and split the party in half. The question then was, who would the Republican Party nominate? And we'll talk about that in next week's video. Thanks.